At the edge of an international border, at the edge of the Pacific, at the edge of innovation, community, education, and discovery, you're listening to At the Edge of It All, a University of San Diego podcast where USD experts speak on topics and stories that impact you and the broader community.
Well, hello. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lisette Martinez.
And I'm Elena Gomez. And with us today, we have Christopher Carter. He is the Assistant Chair and Department Diversity Officer of the Theology and Religious Studies here at the University of San Diego. Chris, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we want to talk a little bit about your book, The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice. What inspired you to write this book?
You know, it's interesting because I think a few things. First, I grew up in a family my grandfather was a migrant farm worker. And so I grew up in a family that, my grandpa had a huge garden. We would go visit his house every summer. We talked a lot about his experiences working in the fields. And especially when we went to visit our family in Mississippi and Louisiana, most of my family lived there. I grew up in Michigan. Food and the growing of food was just a part of our culture. So it was something that we discussed. I didn't necessarily take food justice seriously until I moved to California, just go to graduate school. And part of that, I think, is because I was able to connect my grandfather's experience with the experience I saw of migrant farm workers in California, particularly in the central parts of the state. And the stories my grandfather would tell me would be so terrible, right? They would just be devastating. And to think that people were still living in that same kind of condition, it just bothered me. They're still working in the same kind of conditions. And so, as a person of faith, I was like, well, what kind of response should we have to this, especially as a Black person? And I see the people that are working in these fields are still people of color, be they Latinx now. What does it mean for us to participate in this system? And how can we as people of color actually help change the system in ways that allow those who work in those fields to actually be, seen as full human beings and have human dignity and respect that they deserve?
So what goes into starting a book like this? I'm sure it was not an easy task.
Yeah, it was. I start the book literally by describing that this isn't the book I wanted to write. Like, I think the first sentence in the book is I didn't want to write this book. And it's not so much to say that I didn't want to write a book on food justice as much as it is the recognition that I didn't want to write this particular book on food justice because I decided after several versions of the book to be really personal and to tell the stories of my grandfather and the kind of ways in which he was exploited, and to tell the stories of my mother, having to work multiple jobs, and, us being on food stamps, and her, selling food stamps buying food stamps from junkies to be able to afford to feed us, and just the ways in which my own diet has changed over time. This book was going to require me to be vulnerable and talk about my own experiences in ways that I just wasn't used to in that particular form. It's different. I can be vulnerable in the classroom, because I'm telling a story, but to know something's going to be in print and they're going to see, people are going to know how poor we really were and the food insecurity that we struggle with. That was something that I didn't know that I was going to have to do. And so in that sense, the book was difficult. And the other part that was difficult is reading about and learning about all the ways in which people are harmed by our current food system. The joy in writing the book is thinking about ways in which we can make changes. It ends on a much more positive note, because you have to talk about the harm and the trauma in order to figure out how to heal from it. And so in some sense, even though it's difficult, it's necessary, right, to talk about those things so that we actually can heal from them rather than trying to set them to the side and pretend that they don't really happen or they didn't have an impact on us, right? We all carry that trauma as people of color, Black people especially, of forced agricultural work, right? So how do we draw and create this connection with the land that can be healing, the connection with food that can be healing? That requires us to actually know what happened.
Now, what did you find the most captivating, or what changed you the most as you went through this process in your life?
The story that changed me the most, and the stories that changed me the most actually was visiting plantations. And so a lot of the research was funded by an organization called Farm Forward. They gave me research funding to go visit old plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi to learn about indigenous African agricultural practices. And what I learned in going to these plantations and talking to the scholars on these plantations was just how much wisdom and knowledge that enslaved Africans actually brought to the farms here. I think I was under the impression, as I would say most people of color are, when they learn about American slavery, that Black people were enslaved because of our capacity for labor. The fact that we're brown and we don't sunburn as much as other people and things of that nature. It's much more about the physical capacities. And what I learned in my research is it actually has very little to do with that and has much more to do with our intellect, like our intelligence, our ability to grow food in this climate. And so, for instance, if you are a person, if you're of African descent and you grew up in the Carolinas, the likelihood is that your ancestors can be traced back to the Senegambia region of Africa, because that area grew the same kind of rice crop that was grown in the Carolinas. It's the exact same grain of rice. And so, as a good capitalist would do, right? These enslavers are going to the place in the world where they can buy slaves to grow that particular kind of food, right, where they are. And so it's that kind of knowledge, I think, that for me, just it made me realize that our agricultural history as Black people in America is beyond slavery. I think I felt like I was dealing with we carried the traumatic retentions of enslaved forced agricultural work. And so recognizing that slavery is a part of our agricultural history and not the part of agricultural history, I think I found very liberating and very healing. And it allowed me to present a narrative to people that can, so they could actually begin to heal from that trauma of forced agricultural work and enslavement as well.
Can you talk a little bit about, because a part of your book title is food justice. Can you talk a little bit for people at home that don't know what that is? What is that? What exactly does that mean? And in your book, this is all tying into race and faith. How are these all intersecting? And can you kind of talk more about food justice? Yeah,
so when I'm talking about food justice, I'm talking about an equitable distribution of food amongst the people who live, in America, so that the people who grow the food, the people who work in the fields and produce the food can actually have access to afford to buy the food. And so a just distribution is really what I'm talking about. How can we change the system so that people all along the economic spectrum and the work spectrum on that can actually have access to the food? And so that's kind of a broad way to think about food justice. The reason I think this is a theological issue, right, in terms of how I talk about faith, is that particularly if you're a Christian, so much of Christian theology is about caring for the other. It's about caring for those who are marginalized. It's about making sure that the poor and the widowed and the orphaned are actually provided for. And because most of the people who work in our agricultural sector tend to be low-income people, immigrants, migrants, or historically we would say slaves, I think we have a moral obligation to make sure that those people are cared for as well. Race comes in the fact that most of the people who have worked in agriculture in America have been people of color, right? Whether they be Black, whether they be now Latinx, but also Asians, depending if you're talking about the California and the West Coast, right? Or even in the South, I should also say with Filipinos. So there's a history in this country of exploiting the labor of people of color to grow our food. And so that clearly matters as well when you're talking about faith, right? If we are called to see the image of God, if we're in other people, if we're called to see people as full human beings, how might we treat them in the same ways we want to be treated, right? How might we actually value them and value their work? And so in some senses, to bring light to an issue that a lot of people aren't aware of, because, we go into grocery stores, we are supposed to marvel at the variety of foods that we have. We're not supposed to think about where that food comes from.
Or Professor, even when you think about the quality of food too, right? You have a lot of people who may shop in places where they can purchase organic food, not with so many chemicals that we see in other places, but not everybody can go there. Not everybody has access to that. And that what you just mentioned right now about food and in our faith, even in our cultures. I just remember my grandmother and everyone in my family, I'm Mexican, and I grew up with this idea that food connects you, right, to so many other people. My grandma would always have ample food in her kitchen because whoever came over, whether we knew them or not, whether they were expected visitors or not, her thing was always feed them. We should always have enough to give to others, and where 4 eat, 8 eat, and it just brought back all those memories.
Food tells a story, and I think for many cultures, particularly I would say Mexican and African American, you have cultures where food is a way of showing people love, right? Like making sure we have enough to eat historically in a situation, in a context where people may have not always had enough, is a way to show them how much you actually value them, how much you care.
Right.
And I would suspect your grandmother, like even in providing certain foods, like those are foods that she were taught to prepare.
Correct.
And so there's a story that goes there that it gets passed down in terms of like, this is how I learned it from my mother, and this is why we eat it this way, and this was what this means. Sharing those stories, cooking is a deep and important part of food justice. I'm also trying to kind of enliven as well.
Absolutely. I'll tell you what, every time we go back and visit my husband's mother, most of our time is spent around the kitchen table. Most of our vacation is discussing, we'll eat, and then there'll be some dessert, and then you'll drink some coffee, and then you'll settle down for a while, and then it's time to eat again. It's really, it's part of who we are.
It is, and I think I'm fortunate enough that, one of the sad parts with respect to the book is that my grandmother passed away really young. She had a stroke, and so she died before I could even go to graduate school and write this book. And unfortunately, we made the mistake, like so many other people, of not having her write down her recipes. Mm-hmm. And so we've spent the last 15 years since she's passed, like recreating them. And I do a lot of that, and I've done a lot of that. There's recipes in the book. And so when I go home, I was just home in Michigan visiting in May. I'm the one who does the cooking. And so I do this cooking, and then the same kind of thing, though. We gather around and people tell stories. We talk about what my grandmother used to do and how I'm making it slightly different and things of that nature. And it is a way for us to remember, and help us remember who we are and where we came from, in a way that binds us together. And that's the power of food. And again, one of the other reasons why I want to write this amazing book.
You have a 3-year-old son. You were talking a little bit before. How did this book kind of change the way that you're talking to him about food? Or what is that relationship you have with your son when it revolves around food, since this is something you're passionate about and you study? How is that narrative changing?
Yeah, it's been, I will say, I'm very fortunate that Isaiah has a healthy palate, so he loves all kinds of foods.
That's good.
And yeah, I mean, I was doing a podcast with Mark Bittman, food writer and critic who worked for the New York Times. And I was talking about the things that my son would eat, and Marcus is like, oh my God, Isaiah will have like sriracha tofu scramble on one hand, or, we will eat like any other kind of, any vegan dish that I make.
Oh my God, you're my hero.
Yeah. No, I mean, he really, I think last night we had rice and chickpeas,
wow.
And like, yeah, I mean, he really, I think in part because, and the point I was getting to is that he's been around me cooking his whole life. Because of the pandemic, I had to work from home and teach from home. I was with him all the time. And so he would see me cook. And so we bought him a little kitchen on the side so he could pretend to cook while I was cooking at first. And so that was kind of cute. But that only lasted like, I don't know, maybe like 6 months. And then he wanted to be in the kitchen helping me. And so that's what I have him do. He loves to season things. And I will tell you sometimes, like, because he can reach the cabinet and get things out without me paying attention. No, a couple times he's put seasoning in pots that literally has made something taste better, which is just makes me so happy. That, like, I feel like he's also, it's like, oh, I think this would taste good in there. So it's been an amazing adventure to share the stories of why we eat what we eat and the meals that we make with him, because that's really the only connection that's the primary connection he has to our families, because we live in California and they all still live in Michigan, is me telling these stories as we're cooking.
That's very cool. And you're a vegan as well, right? How does that kind of all tie into sort of understanding where our food comes from? It seems maybe by being vegan, you're trying to live a life of having certain values and kind of correlating more with that food justice. Is that right? Or
yeah, that's exactly right. I always tell people, like, I'm a vegan for the people. A lot of people become vegan because they're concerned about animal welfare, or they're like, oh, I want to make sure that. And for me, I love animals. My wife is a veterinarian. Animals are great. But I'm more concerned about the people who work in the fields and the people who work in those slaughterhouses and not being complicit in those structures that I will call evil. And so for me, the argument that I make in the book about practicing veganism, and I should also say that I recognize that everybody can do it, and I talk about steps for folks like myself who are privileged to create spaces for people to have access to food so then people can eat in a way that's in alignment with their values, really is what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And so for me, veganism is a way to opt out of a food system that I believe is oppressive for not only our environment, right? If you look at now how our food is grown, particularly those factory farms and the ecological harm they cause to their communities, and those again are predominantly rural communities and communities of color, right? So I'm trying to say we need to opt out of those systems as best as we can, so we cause less harm to those communities. And so that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make in the ways in which I practice veganism, is to bring light that kind of suffering of those communities and not to be complicit in it, but also to inspire people to recognize we can I still eat soul food. I just have changed some of the ingredients, but it's still the same things. It's the same feelings that I got growing up eating those foods. And so it's still the same kind of connection that my family eats. Like when I go home and I cook, they all eat vegan because that's what I am.
Right.
And they like it because, well, they don't want to cook, so they're like, well, I'm going to eat it, right? You know. So that's on one hand that helps. And then, exactly. So I'm like, well, they're not cooking, so I'm doing the cooking, but they also know that it tastes good because I've taken the time to really try to, again, recreate those recipes and to feel that kind of connection I had growing up.
If you would to say one thing that you want people to walk away after reading your book, what would that be?
Man, one thing. I would say if there's one thing that I want you to understand, that's so difficult. It would be that ultimately food justice is a call to compassion. We haven't talked about compassion at all so far, but the book is framed around compassion, right? And so how can we be compassionate towards those folks who grow our food? How can we be compassionate towards nature, a non-human nature? How can we be compassionate towards ourselves? So how might the actions that we try to live on a day-to-day basis with respect to food be moved out of compassion? Right? And how might that change how we eat? How might that change where we shop? How might that change what we do in light of being compassionate towards others? A lot of times in the Bible, love can be translated as a form of kind of compassion and justice. And so to me, compassion, I think, it doesn't feel as accusatory, right? It's invitational. I want to invite people to a new way of eating and relating to food, and doing it a way out of love, And so that's kind of the thing I want people to take away from, is how might we be more compassionate?
Kind of just real quickly going back to when we go to the grocery store, I don't think a lot of us are really thinking about where our food comes from or what this means and the backstory and all of that. What are some tips that maybe people can do to be better at that, to really be more conscious of where their food comes from and understanding that and have that compassion that you're talking about?
A couple of things I would recommend is if you can join a co-op. And so there's a really good co-op in San Diego, the OB People's Market, Ocean Beach People's Market. That's great because what they're trying to do is making sure that the farmers who bring food there, they sell it there, are actually getting equitably paid. And that's first and foremost. We have to understand that our farmers, people who grow the food, not even just the farm workers, the people who own the land, they also are being exploited too, and so that's something that we need to make sure we take seriously. So that's one thing to do, is where you buy your food. I would also encourage people to join community supported agricultural organizations. So get produce boxes, right? So that's another thing to try to do, especially in California, because we can grow food year-round in ways that's unique to this particular kind of climate and culture. So those are two things I would highly recommend people being able to do. Going to the grocery store, then you're just looking for like items that are fair trade, I think is really important. But I would say I get the majority of my food from the CSA boxes in the co-op, and then I supplement with other things. And the last thing I would say is, best as you can, opt out of. I would argue that the best way to make an impact in terms of our purchasing food and having a positive impact on our environment is to practice a kind of veganism, to really opt out of as much animal products as you can, because those systems, as we have them in America, really do impact our climate in ways that I think is just deeply, deeply troubling given what we're experiencing right now.
Well, Christopher, we could talk with you for hours. There's so much to dive into from your book. So thanks so much for being with us. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you can listen to our next one.